banking and financial services is an area where we're going to see a lot more migration, not just into open source software, but also into open source hardware. And so the world's changed, higher levels of innovation exist. We think about, I talk about the LF, but pretty much every project management organization, I think they have 760 plus projects right now. But there are many other organizations such as Apache that also have many projects that they help manage and coordinate. And so we live in the slipstream. Typically, we identify what's going on in the world, that you have all these projects, innovation is being produced through these projects, professional management is now coming to projects, more capital than ever over the last 15 years has been contributed to projects through the advent of what I'll call project-based innovation, collaborative development within projects. And you have many more companies coming in. Part of that reason that they're coming in is there's a greater comfort among larger companies, in particular over the last 15 years, around the management of patent risk, the mitigation of risk associated with the adoption of open source code. And so what OIN has done is looked at major projects around the world, looked at what's core. If you look at a project like OpenStack, which now has evolved to actually have another name. But OpenStack originally had a model where it would identify what's core, what's incubated. It had multiple levels of code in each release that it characterized in such a way as to make it easy for people to understand. And so we would take what's core from that project and from literally hundreds of other projects and protect it. And I'll talk about how we protect it. This is just a handful of some of the projects we look at supporting and protecting. I think one of the things that people who are very much committed to the idea of supporting proprietary development have been concerned about with open source from the outset is the notion that it somehow would eliminate the opportunity for innovation through patenting, which is a rather traditional notion that I think many in the open source community are uncomfortable with. And then there's a whole group of companies in the open source community that they're very comfortable with the idea of duality. They've gotten adjusted to the notion that that this idea of co-opetition, which is very much comes out of game theory and was very popular in the mid-90s. Several books written, Harvard Business Review articles talking about the idea of we come together to collaborate to compete more effectively. That whole notion, I think, is a very important one because nowhere other than in open source is that represented in a very explicit manner. I think there have been one-off situations where companies collaborated, but now you've got this high-level collaboration where companies are coming together, and many CEOs have no idea who's talking to whom. And the great thing about it doesn't matter what form of government you have. If you're a company in a particular country, people are collaborating, and that collaboration is very much virulent. And so this isn't about the end of intellectual property for those people who are concerned about that. It's about this notion of practice duality. Where do we invent? Where can we actually differentiate utilizing patents? And where are we living in an open world where the whole idea of inventing is an anathema to participation and collaboration and open sharing? And so participation in the new economy is really about kind of recognizing this, how you manage this duality within an organization. And for many companies, patenting is not something they want to do. Or if you look at Google, for example, Google has a significant portfolio. It's acquired a number of different companies, probably the centerpiece of which from a patent standpoint was Motorola. But it doesn't engage in active monetization or aggressive utilization of its portfolio. It looks for opportunities to collaborate, to be able to create peace rather than to drive a sense of angst out of what they might do with their portfolio. I think many other companies have come to that model. If you look at Microsoft, I mean, it's no secret to those who are observant about the intellectual property space and the risk environment related to large companies with significant portfolios. Microsoft was something that a monolith. They represented a monolithic threat that OIN was formed to be able to deal with. Microsoft now has transitioned dramatically from being a very antagonistic player 15, 16, 18, 20 years ago to now being part of the OIN, to owning GitHub, to having many, many investments that support open source and support open collaboration. In fact, I probably have as many conversations with Microsoft now as I do with any other company in the community, and our community is quite large, as you'll see. And so the mission essentially is to enable open source wherever we find it, whether it's hardware, whether it's software. We want to be able to allow people to make choices, to have freedom of action and freedom to operate. What do you want to use? If you want to have a proprietary play, how is that going to act? How is that component going to interoperate with what you do on the open side? How can you be a good citizen of the open source community, which is really why Microsoft is in OIN, because they recognized that it was about kind of citizenship within a community, recognizing what it takes to be authentic within the open source community, and that's one of the components that they identified was being part of OIN and pledging all of its patents that relate to open source to every other member of the community through a cross license. And so in 2005, IBM, Red Hat, at the time Novell, now SUSE, Sony, NEC, Philips, got together and funded the formation of OIN and created a model around open collaboration on the patent side, again, that parallels what happens on the technical side within the open source community. Google came along later in 2013 and Toyota in 2016 to be able to support this initiative. Each of them provided $20 million, so it's real money. And the whole notion was that we all get together, and where we collaborate, we don't sue each other. Everywhere else, if you want to have patents, you can have patents. It's up to you. But the basic model is that where we collaborate, we don't sue each other. Everywhere else, the normal rules around intellectual property apply, whatever your predisposition is. And that, again, with a company like Microsoft, that keeps evolving. I think even with a company like Red Hat, which we're in the shadow of right now, Red Hat has had an evolving intellectual property strategy designed to support the community of companies, not only companies that are in that adopt its technology, but companies across the open source world. And so OIN is the largest patent non-aggression community in the history of technology. It's largely grown because it focuses on a very narrow area of support for the broader notion of open source. It focuses on patent risk mitigation and allowing for the community to participate in something that is a chronic good, if you will. It's something that's designed to be an ultimate white hat in all of the space of entities that are trying to do things to reduce patent risk, whether it be in open source or otherwise. There's 3,500 plus members. They own 3 million patents that have been pledged. Those of which in that total pool of patents that read on open source functionality, core open source functionality that we put into something called the Linux system definition. We expand that all the time. OIN is unlike anything that's ever existed. There's no analog in the history of kind of intellectual property or just corporate development. We not only have the ability, once a company joins, we have all these companies that join, we have the ability to expand the scope of the license, this Linux system, if you will, unilaterally without approval of the companies that are part of the community. And that's a little bit for people who do licensing, that's a scary thought. But for people who are recognized that we are attempting to emulate the authenticity of the community by being a safe pair of hands, if you will, in expanding the definition, expanding the scope of the license to accommodate the growth of Linux and adjacent open source technologies. They understand that we're acting in a rational way to be able to look after the community's interest of risk reduction associated with patenting. And so we own over 1,000 patents. We've spent $100 million buying patents and inventing, growing portfolios, acquiring entities sometimes that are companies that are maybe on the wrong side of history that are going bankrupt, and we might take the IP from them by buying the remaining assets and then putting them into the portfolio. We make all those patents that we own available on a royalty-free basis, an unlimited field of use. So even if you are using the functionality that's claimed in those patents in a proprietary system, you're still covered. It's free to everyone. The cross-license access is Linux-centric, core Linux and open source centric, but that's free as well. And we have about 3,300 packages now, elements of code that sit inside the cross-license. And those things define the scope of the cross-license. As I said, we started out with 1,100. We're now at 3,300. Our board just 2 weeks ago approved another few hundred packages that will be coming in and we'll be announcing later this fall. And so we've done what would otherwise be the impossible of getting companies, large companies, to come together to agree to expose their entire portfolio to a cross license that supports open source and Linux. And we've gotten them to agree that we are the safe pair of hands and the trusted arbiter of what should be included in the broader cross license. We don't do that alone. We have a technical advisory council, which is one representative from each of the companies that I mentioned that are the funders of OIN, but we also have several dozen regular contributors and nominators of packages that should be included in this Linux system. How we expand is based on the inputs that we get from our members, but also from ordinary licensees who are out there. We have a technical advisory council, which formalizes who can contribute and what they can contribute and how they contribute. We have regular meetings between the technical committee and the technical advisory council. We look for outreach. We go to SFC. We've gotten contributions, nominations from them, from SFLC, from FSF, from all manner of players that are out there. We're very inclusive, and we have one of the keys for me was to have a positive relationship with everyone in the community and to recognize that there may be different viewpoints around patenting. We're not promoting any specific viewpoint. We're just recognizing that patents exist. We encourage companies that choose to do so to appeal to Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Tokyo, and other patent and trademark offices to promote policies that they would like to see promulgated. But at the same time, we're focused on, again, narrowly focused on mitigating risk associated with the adoption of open source code, to encourage more adoption, to encourage more inclusion in large, medium-sized, small projects, and make sure that technology has an opportunity to flourish in an open source modality. And it's all about inclusivity. These 3,500 organizations, 157 of 195 countries represented. And we do this in a very purposeful way. We want to support the notion of inclusivity. This isn't a US thing. This isn't a European thing, a Chinese thing, a Japanese thing. This is global. The phenomenon's global. We should reflect the community. This gives you an idea of the representation. We're very proud that it's not majority North American, and we're particularly proud of what's happened in APAC and in South and Central America in terms of our growth. When I started this, my tenure, I think the APAC expectation was that we'd probably never get to more than 10 or 15% of the total. But what's been heartening is that as we've grown, the community of participation in major projects and medium-sized projects has actually kind of paralleled what we've done. And so we're living the slipstream of these project management organizations and individual projects, and Asia has become an incredible growth engine for participation. I think it's not an accident that our growth over the last 5 years has been most significant in Asia, and also participation in Linux Foundation projects has been most significant in terms of Asian participation. So again, we're paralleling, and it's not just small companies that we have from Asia. We have some of the largest companies in the world, including Huawei, Baidu, Ali, Tencent, 360, most of the major car companies. There are 26 car and truck companies in China. We've got well over half of that. We have Alipay, WeChat Pay, which is Ant Financial. We have the largest clearing bank in the world, which is Union Pay, that clears all of those mobile payments transactions every day. And so this gives you a sense of this concept of the slipstream. I mean, we're talking to OpenAtom about whatever they can do. They have 6 projects right now. We'd love it if they have professional management, and they can provide the kinds of expertise that other organizations like the LF and Apache and others are providing, Eclipse are providing to the companies that participate, and that they can actually grow real projects. And so we're not, again, linked just to Western project management organizations. We're linked across the board to anyone who wants to be in the world of creating an opportunity for this project-based innovation. And so this is essentially this process of Linux system definition is drawn from major projects, minor projects, to be able to grow to cover the key technologies that we should be covering and putting into this patent non-aggression zone. So this idea of parallelism, again, is very important to me. Technical collaboration parallels the collaboration that we have encouraged on the legal front, and we want that symmetry. This gives you an idea of packages. We have many, those of you who are interested, we have many breakdowns. Some of this is available on the website, a lot of it is. But if you're very concerned about a particular package and why it's in or why it isn't in, we are open to maintaining a dialogue. And we'll take nominations from incredibly small projects, from individuals, from universities, from research institutes, as well as from, again, the companies that are in our community most immediately, which are the companies who fund OIN. And so we've evolved, as you'd expect, the common base packages. Linux was an incredibly important element that we were looking to support from the outset. That's why the density of packages that are common base packages from Linux, the kernel itself, and then engineering packages. Enterprise computing was where we started in terms of what we were protecting or most focused on protecting. And then as Android and Chromium and all manner of other project technologies have been released, we've been looking to bring those in, incorporate them. Automotive grade Linux, the list I put up before is, again, just a sample of the projects that we support through the incorporation of code that's critical to those particular activities. This just gives you a representative sample of the kinds of companies that are in our community. AT&T, for those of you who don't know, is one of the largest, historically the most successful monetizer of patents in all of the carrier space. It also happens that AT&T is one of the most aggressive supporters of open source. The CTO, deputy CTO, head of software, all committed at a fundamental level to supporting open source projects. In fact, many of the Linux Foundation's networking projects would not exist without support from AT&T. So this is a perfect example of how you can live with a certain duality. They monetize on the one hand, but they're also a major contributor to and supporter and advocate for a number of projects. And so Reliance Jio, one of the first 5G networks, Rakuten, another of the early 5G networks that are advanced, that have only been built in the last 3 to 5 years. KDDI, Vodafone, Verizon, so SK Telecom, we're all over the world in terms of who we're including. Internet companies, software companies. As I said, Ali has been in OIN for some time, and we have a great relationship there, just as we do with Microsoft and others. And so we're responsive to companies when they have particular issues. I'll talk about how those issues manifest themselves. And then banking and financial services, which I'll be talking about more as we go forward in this presentation. Truist is a super regional Sumitomo Mitsui Bank Corporation is a hyper bank based in Japan. There are only 3 hyper banks in Japan that represent really what used to be 30 different banking institutions just 15 years ago. Tencent, obviously, it's an Ant Financial with WeChat Pay and Alipay. TD Bank, Marqeta, Stripe, Square, Ethereum. So it really runs the gamut. It's not just 1 or 2 specific areas. We're very close to getting Bank of America to come in. We're growing the community all the time. Barclays and TD or money center banks. Automotive space, we have a list that's 4 times this for automotive. We've been very successful in growing the automotive space. And I think it's important. The reason I have these two groupings or sectors together is that automotive is undergoing a transformation as an industry. It was once a very proud, technically sophisticated, technology-driven industry. You think back to particularly the foundations of the industry with Daimler. And over time, they've allowed tier 1s and tier 2s to kind of dictate their strategy in terms of technology. That's changing and creating a certain amount of stress and tension between tier 1s and the automakers themselves. But they recognize that, as Jim Zemlin's fond of saying, that the disintermediation of their industry was occurring with a smartphone and a piece of Velcro. And they're now trying to get ahead of the curve to be able to redesign vehicles so that the digital DNA of a vehicle is open source based. Be it for mission critical operations of the vehicle, as well as for entertainment and infotainment in the cabin of the vehicle. And so what you have happening now is that companies are hiring at pretty significant levels, both all throughout the automotive space, are hiring talent in and developing software groups to be able to grow. Ambition, for example, is Daimler's software group, several hundred people based in Berlin that are focused on developing software to be able to support the next generation of what Daimler will be. And the same is true for many other organizations. You see lots of recs out there for talented open source developers so they can come in and remake these organizations from the inside out. I think that's very compelling. And I think what we're starting to see in banking and financial services is a similar trend. While banks and financial services have always been financial engineers, they've not been technically sophisticated for the most part. They've eaten their food pre-chewed from large companies that come in and provide a solution to them. That's happening less and less. The roadmap is something they are co-developing, and that will only increase. When I talk to banks, talking about hardware, I mean, the automotive space is already doing this, but when I tell banks that, 5 to 7 years from now, you'll be taping out your own chips, and RISC-V will be very important to your future on the hardware side, it's still a little bit of a lot to swallow. It's still a bit much to swallow. But banks or automotive companies, they get that. They've been doing this for a number of years already, and they want to be able to escape from the hegemony of the embedded space, controlling innovation, and they want to be able to actually design something themselves that they can design or they can create products around rather than have to take something off the shelf. And so that dynamic is changing dramatically. And that's one of the key alterations, I think, for banking and financial services, is that they're becoming much more aware and accountable for their own innovations, and open source is at the center of that movement. And I think that's a really important trend because most people look at banking and financial services companies and they think about them as service providers, but not technology developers. That's changing. And again, automotive has set the tone for that kind of change that banking and financial services can follow the model of. Hardware companies, semiconductor. I mean, we do have some semiconductor companies in here, industrials, large industrial companies. I think when Caterpillar first approached us a number of years ago, I was thinking about what their angle was, but it just shows that 5 years before, at the turn of the century, you would have never thought that they were going to be, kind of interested in software. But software is really important. It's the most strategic of all technical initiatives that Caterpillar has underway right now, and as do all the companies that are in the construction space, as well as in the John Deeres of the world and the other companies that are in the ag space. Energy companies, clearly the LF has an energy project now, and I think increasingly distribution companies, generation companies are getting more and more concerned with software and re-architecting their networks, really following the lead, just as I talked about autos and banking. What energy companies are doing is following the lead of AT&T and the lead telecom carriers that are big adopters of open source, in that they're re-engineering, re-architecting the network so they're more efficient, lower cost, lower power, lower carbon footprint. Consumer electronic goods, information technology, media and entertainment. This just gives you a sense of this migration. This started 4 years ago, when Ant and UnionPay, Alipay, and WeChat Pay and Sumitomo Mitsui came in, and then late last year, Barclays and TD Bank, and now this year, we have another 5 or 6 companies that I expect to join before the end of the year that are lead financial services companies who are recognizing the importance of open source. Once companies recognize that open source is critical to the future of their technical development and the offerings that they can make to their community of customers, then they recognize that they need to support a community ethic, because participating in OIN is it's no cost. What it is essentially allowing companies to protect themselves from the risk of adoption of open source code from a myriad of companies that are out there. First, it's operating company risk that we're looking at, but then again, it's also evolved as OIN has brought in Microsoft. In particular, we've evolved to be able to support more non-practicing entity risk, and to be able to do patent troll interdiction. And so this is why people join the community. They want to mitigate risk. They want adoption, comfort around adoption. They know it's no cost. And the patents that they hold, any company that thinks it's going to retain patents to be able to hold up the open source community misunderstands the open source community. I think that's a fundamental flaw in some people's thinking. And if you look at embedded companies, I would say they have not gotten religion yet. Even though many of them participate in open source projects and are good citizens and have great development teams that are working on open source, the corporate senior level strategies don't quite recognize how they fit within this interesting and elegant system of collaborative development, and finding the way to evolve their business models. It's going to be one of the great challenges of the next 10 years for the embedded companies, particularly with what's happening in open hardware. RISC-V will have this transformational effect first on mobile device chip suppliers, but then ultimately on the entire chip ecosystem. And so I'm excited about what's happening there. And again, we are evaluating what we can do, taking the success we've had on the software side, how do we bring that to the hardware side? That's what keeps me up at night. That's what I'm focused on for the next 3 to 4 years, is developing a vehicle where we can be relevant to be able to reduce risk on the hardware side the way we have on the software side. Defensive support, I'll talk a little bit about. This applies to non-practicing entity risk. And so if a company is at risk or in litigation, they'll come to us, and in some cases, we've worked with them to forward deploy patents if they were being threatened by an operating company, so they could defend themselves in a cross license, create equivalence, and reduce the pain that they'd have to suffer from licensing or from litigation. And so for operating companies, that works. For non-practicing entities, giving them patents doesn't really help them. So what we have to do is work with outside entities like unified patents, proactive patents, to be able to attack poor quality patent applications and have them essentially rejected before they've been granted, or work with granted patents with unified patents to attack them, to have the patents invalidated. And so we have ongoing programs with both organizations. And we work with companies on a regular basis in a quiet and supportive way. We're not the stars of any show. We're players in a much larger theater to be able to affect a change in how people think and how they think in particular about intellectual property. And so we become over time, in the 15 years we've been around, 16 years now, a litmus test for authenticity. Again, Microsoft played that back to us when they came to us and said they wanted to participate in OIN, because they recognized, buying GitHub, it was probably a nice companion piece to show that you're actually pretty authentic in the community and just not talk about it, but would actually prove it by putting your patent portfolio on offer. And so the PAE, or patent assertion entity or interdiction activities in fintech and beyond, we had a little case study. Last year, this time, a major card company was being asserted against by one of the largest patent assertion entities in the world. Very deep-pocketed, very interesting patents on some of the most fundamental technologies that banks use from the open source community. Not a good combination of elements to put you at ease if you're a bank or the general counsel of a bank or the head of intellectual property at a bank. And so we supported them by looking at the patents, by doing invalidity claim charting, helping them see what prior art was out there, talking to the community. We have a great relationship with many of the CTOs at a very significant number of projects as well as companies, and soon being able to do the outreach and efficiently get information on the origins of an innovation, of an invention, which are often predate the patent filings that we find out there that are being used against the community. We do, as I said, re-exams. We're doing prior art identification before patents granted to get a patent application rejected. We do IPRs. And so we're doing a whole range of things, which are real money that we're putting out to be able to reduce risk. This just gives you an example earlier in the year, kind of first quarter of what was happening. And financial services has the highest year-on-year jump in it's actually carried through. I've seen some numbers recently for Q2, and it's very similar that a lot of litigation is coming to the financial services space. And a lot of the new technology that they're incorporating is open source. And so it's creating a situation where not all of the litigation is open source focused, but a significant percentage is. This just gives you a sense up top of non-practicing entity activities. And you look at some of the technologies that are at play here: Apache, Hadoop, Spark, Kafka, Kubernetes, Hadoop framework. Hadoop has been the subject of litigation for, I think, 7 cases in the last 4 years. There are a couple of patent assertion entities that claim to have patents that read on Hadoop. And I think Cloudera has been trying to work through that. Obviously, Cloudera is at the center of that, and they are often sued in these litigations. But also the banks are sued in many of these cases. RDC is essentially when you scan a check. This is not related to open source necessarily, but open source technology is involved usually in some way. When you scan a check and you deposit that check virtually, that activity, several entities, non-practicing entities and practicing entities, have patents that claim to read on that functionality. And there have been some very large awards made, close to $1 billion in awards just against Wells Fargo over the last year and a half. So this is, again, real money. And what we, again, tried to do is to get ahead of this by working to attack patents before they're granted, patent applications before they're granted, and to use unified patents as an external partner to attack these patents, to attack already granted patents that are potentially threatening. And so these are the kinds of things that we're involved in on a regular basis, monitoring and supporting these kinds of entities to make sure that they are, again, able to make choices, able to see their own way through to kind of put themselves in a position where they they can feel comfortable about adoption of open source code. And a number of other cases. And you look at the technology, some of it is squarely like the HPE suit, Docker, Hadoop, Kubernetes. I think we see that coming up again and again. Triple I, which is this 3321 suit, they have a raft of really interesting patents that they claim are reads on these technologies. And I think, the broad scale, I mean, you think about the growth of Kubernetes and Docker, just over the last 3.5 years, it's incredible how that's why that project is probably the most successful project that the Linux Foundation has. And it's and two of the projects really are supported, two of the technologies are supported by Google originally, and then Google's gift to the world. But now they've taken off at an extreme level. And so with the broad scale adoption of these technologies and the fact that there are multiple patent assertion entities holding patents that read on these technologies, we've had to adjust our model to not just focus on monolithic threats like Microsoft, but to focus on skirmishes that are happening all over the place. Fires are breaking out, and we need to be able to deal with those through the methods that I've described. In addition, what we are doing but haven't announced, but I'll talk about it here. We are looking at, and we've made approaches through third parties that are representing us at some of the entities mentioned here. About doing sliver licenses. So basically doing an open source license where all open source functionality is available to the bulk of our licensee community, to be able to allow them to partake of a free license or a free license, or depending upon how big they are. If they're small, they'll get a free license. If they're big, they might have to pay something. But the idea is to create opportunities for risk to be mitigated by having companies participate in gaining access to patents that might otherwise be threatening to their ability to kind of utilize open source technology, and particularly really interesting technology like Docker, Kafka, Kubernetes, Hadoop, and stuff that comes from OpenShift and OpenStack as well. So while we've moved away from, the threat from practicing entities has reduced dramatically over the last 16 years of OIN's existence. The threat has shifted. Companies recognize that the patents that they had can't possibly be used to slow or stall the progress of Linux because it's self-defeating. They need Linux. More and more companies are recognizing their interdependencies or dependencies on each other and on open source to be able to innovate in the way they want to. As a result, they don't need their patents anymore. They sell them, third parties acquire them, and then the problem gets transferred to companies that don't have any conscience, don't have a horse in the race, so to speak. They're not operating. They don't care about what happens on the operating side. Their only focus is monetization and return on capital. And those kinds of companies have to be dealt with in a different way. That's why we're doing what we do in that community. We're trying to deal with that with an approach that makes sense for us. And so, if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to take them, whether they're online or whether they're in the room. Thanks very much for your attention, by the way. And questions don't have to be today. You can reach out to me anytime, reach out to any of the members of my team, go on the website, look at what we included in Linux system definition. If it's not broad enough, if we should have other packages, that really helps us when you say, hey, you might want to look at this package because this is really important to our company. This is what we're standardizing on, and you don't have it protected. So bring it in. And if you're part of a company that's not part of the community, it's free. It's really a code of conduct, set of norms around how one utilizes patents in an increasingly open source centric world. That's kind of what we do on a daily basis, is build community. And so we're glad to have you join and be part of that movement, because it really is an evolution where every day it's one foot in front of another project comes out, another set of companies come in, because they recognize it's integral to protecting themselves as they look to adopt more and more code. Comments, questions? Again, thanks very much. Appreciate you being here, and stay safe. And we'll see you. But again, feel free to reach out anytime.